if a bill passes, don't just think like, oh, did this compromise or not, but like who benefited, right? Who was in the room when that was being discussed? And that I think is really the trick here, is that legislation, whether it's, you know, more about your member voted for compromise or they stuck to their principle, is that normal Americans aren't seeing a lot out of those policies. So then the question is, you know, who is, and how can that change? And that's, I think, really the crux of all of this, is that it is, you know, really challenging and really partisan, and I think in a lot of ways really rotten. But it doesn't have to be that way. Politics is about choices.
Welcome to the 6th edition of A Survey Course for Everyone. And I'm really pleased and excited about our panel today. Today's panel is delving into the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on politics, partisanship, and also the impact of partisanship on politics and policy related to COVID. We have with us two experts on two different aspects of the national response. We have Sarah Binder from the Brookings Institute, who will speak to us about congressional response, and Julia Azari of Marquette University, who will speak to presidential and party politics. Moderating tonight's event, or this afternoon's event, is Brian Conley, who is a professor of political science in the Department of Political Science and Legal Studies at Suffolk University. So I want to turn over the discussion now to Brian. Brian.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Professor Coolidge, Professor Cobb, and welcome everybody else who's joining us today. So this should be an interesting, an insightful discussion we're gonna have. I'm gonna start actually with Professor Azari, because she's an expert in the presidency and in parties, political parties in the United States. Because the first question I have, which I think many people have, is, you know, we're just months away now from the November general election, and we wanna know, like, you know, the conventional wisdom in political science is that elections are referendums. They're referendums on incumbents when we have an incumbent president who can run again. And so I want to know, to what extent do you think, Professor Azari, that this election is going to be a referendum on Trump? And if so, what will that referendum look like? Because just in the context of how dynamic what's going on here with the country and sheltering in place and the economy really in a very kind of a desperate situation, you know, how is this going to impact the general election, and how particularly is it going to impact Trump's prospects?
Great, thanks. Thanks so much for inviting me to be on this great panel. So I want to actually, when we talk about the election as a referendum on the incumbent president, there's really two things that can, I think, help illustrate that. And those are two things you don't often hear in the same sentence, which are Ronald Reagan and math. So I think that the way to think about this really is Ronald Reagan's question in 1980 with the Jimmy Carter running as the incumbent president, asking, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? I think that's actually quite a resonant question that's on the minds of voters, particularly this sought after swing constituency, whoever and however large that constituency may be, who might be thinking they're not particularly wed either the GOP or the Democratic Party, but they're thinking about, you know, how is politics affecting their lives? Do they feel like the status quo is good, or do they feel like the status quo is not good? And I think that the way that this, you know, let me talk about how this is supported by evidence and isn't just a hunch, and then about how this has played out in the last couple of elections. So I don't have any graphs or any equations to spit out or anything, but I do want to just emphasize that this is supported by a variety of political science research, by a variety of studies that suggest that you can actually do a pretty good job predicting the percentage of the vote that the incumbent party candidate will win based on factors like the status of the economy, how long has that party controlled the presidency. There's a model, we call these models, don't let that intimidate you. It's just a way of using numbers to try and understand outcomes. You know, that there's some of these models draw on, you know, is the country at peace, things like that, right? Trying to measure in a simple, quantifiable kind of way, what is the status quo like? And I think that right now it's not super subtle, right? What is the status quo like? I don't know of a model, which is not to say one doesn't exist, that looks at public health, and I suspect we'll probably get some research that tries to quantify that and look at that as a variable. But certainly between the public health situation and the economy, I really want to emphasize, before we get into the specifics of the Trump presidency, that this would be a rough situation for pretty much any incumbent. This would be a rough situation. Obviously, incumbent decision-making and who holds office and how they conceptualize their role as a nation's leader in a time of crisis makes a difference. But the president can't wave a magic wand and make things better, and this would be a rough go for anybody. And just briefly, I want to put that in the context of the last two elections, because I think that some of what drove 2012 and 2016, those presidential races, is the status quo was kind of it was okay. The economy in those cases, it was improving, it was good but not great. Things were okay, but they weren't amazing. And I think those kinds of close elections, particularly 2016, mean that a lot of different kinds of factors can matter. Sometimes that means that the debate turns to more cultural issues. And that, even though it's quite recent, is a dramatically different context than where we find ourselves in 2020. And my cat Sydney says hello.
Oh yes, well, hello back. But see, okay, so you're absolutely right. There's a group of scholars. This time, every election cycle, they come out with their models predicting a certain day in advance how what the likely outcome is. Now, of course, we're looking at a situation now where the economy basically, it's a question of whether it even exists in the United States. So that's obviously going to be adverse to Trump. So my feeling is, we would think, to put it differently, that given the economic condition in the country right now, that Trump would have no chance. Now, but so I frame it this way: to what extent do you think the polarization in the country, the fact that we're so deeply polarized, what effect do you think that might shield Trump from the referendum effect, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question that I think we're still working on the answers to. And I think 2020 will be a really important data point there. I know that in 2012, there were some attempts in this kind of modeling world to incorporate partisan polarization, and it didn't really help. I think partisan polarization potentially is sort of baked in. It's also potentially the case that we will actually see, the way that we would say this in political science is Trump overperforms the model, right? Because as you said, I get nervous using the language of no chance, just because we're kind of muddling up two different forms of prediction. I'm going to go off on a tangent right now. I'm just warning everybody, but I think it's important to be clear about this. The forecasting that you often see done in media outlets speaks in this language of chance, right? What are the chances that Trump will win? What are the chances Biden will win? And I think you're going to see some confident predictions about Biden, just as we saw of Clinton in 2016, that are kind of, if conditions are like this, what would we expect the outcome to be? That's different than a lot of the academic forecasting models, which attempt to predict the vote share, right? And so they predict what percentage of the vote, Republicans or Democrats, will win. And there's some statistics you can go into looking at the kind of the confidence intervals around those estimates and things like that. I don't think people are here for a big technical discussion of this, but if they want one, they can find one on the internet. They can email me. I'll direct them to the right resources. But I do want to emphasize those two things are different, right? So the models would predict Trump getting a very low share of the vote. Perhaps that share is higher given the strength of partisanship. But I also think that what we don't necessarily know is what percentage of the presidential electorate in a given year are hardcore partisans. And I think that number is not as high as you would imagine if you spend a lot of time, as I do, on, say, politics Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, okay, well, so I have another question, which I'm intrigued by your reference to Carter in the 1980 election with Reagan, right? Because my other one is this. I mean, I know some of the research you've done kind of talks about, and we talk about in political science in general, political parties as teams, and so you know, that's the thing. So Carter was not really a team player in the Democratic Party. He wasn't particularly well liked. You know, it didn't really help him so much in the 1980 election. What do you think about Trump? I mean, is Trump a team player within the Republican Party? Is that going to help or hurt him in November?
Yeah, I think this is a really fascinating and incredibly complicated question. And a lot of people, including me, have actually written trying to compare the context of the Carter presidency and the Trump presidency, looking not so much at the two individuals as people, not at all, but looking at where they kind of fall in a regime. Carter is the end of the New Deal regime, Trump is the end of the Reagan regime, and looking at those possibilities. And part of that characteristic, part of that context is being someone who's a bit of an outsider to the party and who runs on a kind of Washington outsider ticket. And then, as you point out, Jimmy Carter comes in to office in 1977 with all these ideas where he's going to fix what's wrong with Washington. And it turns out his fellow Democrats are the ones who run Washington, and they're not super excited about that. I think that, like, you should have seen more of that with Trump almost in 2017, and you don't. I mean, I think the Republican congressional majority is less entrenched than the Democratic congressional majority was in the late 70s. Control of Congress is a lot more competitive. And I'm now getting into Sarah's territory, which I shall stay out. But I do think that Trump has had quite a bit of loyalty among congressional Republicans. We might be starting to see some of that break down as those congressional Republicans see their fortunes more tied to the economy, the coronavirus, and less tied to the president himself. But I do think that even as Trump comes in as this kind of party insider from an organizational perspective and an elite perspective, that he has, for most of his presidency, had tremendous influence over Republicans in the electorate, and really has had a read on the sentiment in a good portion of the Republican electorate and has communicated in a way that's been very resonant with those voters, and members of Congress see the writing on the wall. And that, I think, is the big difference between Trump and Jimmy Carter.
Right. Well, you know, then actually maybe another also parallel to 1980 and Reagan. You know, Reagan's famous saying that the government was not going to be the solution but the problem, right? You know, I know some of the research that you've done talks about Trump as a 19th century president. Maybe in some respects that's where Reagan was trying to go too. But you know, my understanding of it is, you say, to quote you, you know, that Trump is in some ways a normal 19th century president. The issue is that he's serving in the 21st century. What do you mean by that? And what do you mean by that? How do you think it's affected his response to the pandemic?
Great. Yeah, what a great question. So I think that so I wrote this piece for 538 in August of 2017. I think it published in September of 2017. And I was thinking about two main things. The first is Trump's seeming lack of interest in moral leadership and being kind of the national rhetorical leader of the country. At that time we were coming fresh off of the violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I was really struck by Trump's response to that. Not just some of the things that you hear people talk about in regard to that, his sort of, you know, there's lovely people on both sides or whatever it was, but also kind of talking about how his family has a vineyard in Charlottesville, and it was just kind of very, you know, personalistic and about commercial interests and not about the nation. I actually think, to speak to your point about Reagan, is whatever people might think about Reagan's policies, I think he very much saw himself as someone who was going to step into that role as a national moral leader, and had, you know, a number of pieces of rhetoric, like after the Challenger explosion, that really spoke to people and not necessarily just people in his party base. Trump, it's not even necessarily that when he does that, it's only speaking to his base, or it's like the speeches are kind of stilted, which sometimes happens with presidents. But it's like, my sense of that, it was my sense at the time, it's my sense now, is that he's just not interested in that role. The second thing, which speaks, I think, also to the pandemic, is that in the 19th century, the presidency was a different animal because the federal government just had much less of a role. And you saw a lot more policy, regulation, health policies, police powers at the state and local level, which still very much, I mean, I think you're sort of seeing that now, just how much of those types of decisions are below the national level now. But in the 19th century, that was especially true. And so the presidency wasn't the kind of big animal that it is now. And it wasn't the focus of government. It's much more congressionally centered. And that was something I also saw with Trump early on, was this sort of sense of letting Congress kind of run the policy show and determine the policy agenda, even though that's kind of out of step with the way that contemporary presidents do things. And I think both of these things really speak to the pandemic response and to the reason why we have an office that now has evolved into this major national leadership figure, and what happens when someone doesn't quite step into the expanse of that office.
Yeah, well, that's a good transition to questions I have for Professor Binder, because, again, Trump is my takeaway from what you're saying, right, is that Trump kind of, again, has this diminished notion of both maybe the federal government as well as the executive office. But then the question is, okay, so if he's absent, what is Congress doing? So that is my first question for Professor Binder. I'd like her to give us a quick kind of rundown on what Congress did do back in March and April to respond to the COVID pandemic. And then, as we know, too, what it's about to potentially do in the next week or two. So if you would, Professor Binder, just give us a quick rundown on what happened how did Congress respond in March and April?
Sure. Well, first, thanks very much for having me. This is great. One quick word before we talk about what they did in March and April, because it's just so stunning, I think, to a lot of people, given how little Congress has done, not just under divided government since 2019, when Democrats took control of the House, leaving Republicans in control of the White House, but over a 10, 20-ish year period of very relatively little legislating by Congress. And we can come to some data soon on that. But what did they do? And in that context, where we haven't seen Congress address big issues on the agenda, in the month of March, within a 3-week period, they passed a set of emergency relief measures, plus one in April, that added up to roughly $3 trillion. All told, probably, depending on how we count things, the largest emergency response ever by Congress to a crisis. They started with very small potatoes, early March, $8 billion, which in congressional terms is like teeny weeny little finger potatoes, just $8 billion for healthcare costs. They realized pretty quickly, because that was early March, about 2 weeks, while we were still all shaking hands and trying not to touch our faces, they gave a little money for healthcare workers. March 18th, they expanded, there was paid sick leave for the first time for certain people under certain conditions, and then the first round of money for free testing. That was about $100 billion. By end of March, they generated what we now call the CARES Act, which was almost $2 trillion of emergency relief, money for state and local governments, money for healthcare workers, money for hospitals, money for businesses to keep people on their payrolls, expanded unemployment insurance that we'll come to, because those extra boost in unemployment is now expiring as we speak. And then a whole several billion dollars, about $400 billion given to Treasury to help basically allow the Federal Reserve to leverage its own loans to corporations and to Main Street businesses to try to keep them afloat. And then there was one more late April, they tacked on another almost $500 billion to sustain money to hospitals and to this, what we call PPP, Payroll Protection Program, right? Giving money that could turn into grants for businesses to keep people on their payrolls. So it was really quite, in congressional terms, pretty, let alone historical terms, a remarkable response.
Yeah, well, so that again raises two questions there for me, or at least one for sure. Number one, yes, you have this period of like pretty intense activity, as you just kind of outlined in good detail there. But what's happened since? And so so it's kind of two questions. The first one is it true that basically a crisis will change the way that congressional deal making happens? Maybe put a different way, is Congress more productive during a crisis? Because it does appear as though maybe that was true in March and April. But then the follow-up question would be, well, what's happened since? So I guess you have these two competing trends.
Right. So one question, on the surface, it seems, yeah, Congress needs a crisis to motivate action, right? And that would help explain why in the wake of, say, September 11th and the attacks in New York and in Washington, why there was this immediate rallying around to generate the 9/11 response. We can think of other crises where we might have seen a similar landmark response. At the same time, though, I can point at crises and Congress didn't act. I mean, even one of the last several months, many people would argue that, in fact, police brutality and police misconduct and racial injustice constitutes a crisis. But we've not seen action. Other people would say the response in Newtown to the shootings in 2013, or to last summer's the Pulse nightclub, or the El Paso, Texas Walmart, or Parkland, right? That seemed to many people to be a crisis, but no congressional response. So a crisis might be necessary, but it's not sufficient.
Yeah.
And of course we see Congress act even without a crisis. So maybe it's not even necessary. So I would think of it this way, and then we could think about what does that mean for what's coming up. I'm tempted to say that the real issue here is what does it take to get both sides to the bargaining table? Both sides, both in this case parties plus the White House, right? Both parties have to think that the costs of saying no, I'm not going to deal, that the costs are so high that they have to go to the bargaining table because they don't want to be blamed for a really bad outcome, which is Congress not filling the need. And so you see that certainly in crisis, right? I think that's what's boiling over here, right? Can either party get away with not acting? Mm-hmm. No, they couldn't. And so I think we tend to see a lot of these messaging battles, a lot of trying to deflect the blame. And you can hear a little bit of that going on currently now, where the two House and Senate and Democrats and Republicans are trying to figure out, will there be another big deal and what will be in it? Mitch McConnell, Senate Republican Majority Leader, just on the floor today said, well, if the Democrats and Pelosi won't budge, it's their fault. Why are they standing in the way? And Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker, is like, what are you talking about? We pass a $3 trillion here and we call it the HEROES Act.
Right. Yeah. So I guess so it raises the question, which, by the way, I also want to ask for our audience about whether or not, people approve or not, or disapprove of how Congress has responded to this. Because I guess, some of the research that you've done, Professor Binder, has referenced this idea of blame avoidance, right? That maybe Congress at different points in time, and this might also be impacted by partisanship, is motivated by a notion of blame avoidance. Like, was it true that maybe there was some action early on, but in part because it was obviously affecting the country, but maybe not every part of the country, so that could have partisan dynamics? And now we're in a situation where, again, we're getting closer to the November election. We have a surge. We have, over 150,000 plus are in that neighborhood of people who've died. Is this now a situation where they're panicking because they're either going to be blamed? They're going to be blamed at the ballot box for not doing anything.
Sure. So let's try a graph. I think when these massive responses were done in March and then in April, and really through the month of May, the biggest hit was on Democratic states, blue states, largely in the Northeast and then on the West Coast. And what I want to show here is we can take a look at what's the partisanship of the state. So on that x-axis, the far left, strong Republican states, far right, strong Democratic states. And what's on the y-axis going up and down is essentially, these are Google mobility data. Like, what percentage of decline was there in people leaving their homes from basically early February to when these data were collected in June? And so the lower the level here, the -20, that's a 20% cut in people leaving, essentially on average, people leaving their homes in those states. And you can see that it is hard. Is this an economic measure? Is it a measure of the impact of COVID? It's both, right? And so the blue states are really hit hard throughout much of this period. And red states, i.e. the ones here run by Trump and more partisan leaning to the Republicans, are really relatively unscathed. And I think that's probably behind everybody's wondering, well, why did Pelosi come out with a $3 trillion deal in May? And the leader of the Republican Party essentially said, let's wait and see. And I think the wait and see was, do we really need to do more, or can we turn to fiscal stimulus, tax cuts and so forth? Do we really have to go spend more money? And given that there's Republicans who don't want to spend so much money. So
Yeah.
there's clearly partisan hits here, and clearly the virus has spread to those Republican states. And as you said, it's leaving the Republicans with a lot more pressure to act, lest they be blamed for more gridlock.
Right. We're clearly in a different situation, both in terms of reality and in terms of perception. You know, if there was a time when some percentage of elected officials in the country thought they were not going to be impacted by COVID, that's clearly no longer the case. We now have actually just got the results of the poll. So it says, you know, do you approve or disapprove of the way Congress is handling its job? So 21% say yes, and 53% say no, and 26% are unsure. So we have 53%, roughly half, saying that they're not, do not approve. But, you know, I actually want to ask another question to the audience too, but well, how do you evaluate your individual member? Because again, as Professor Binder is an expert in this and knows, there's often kind of a somewhat of a, you know, a variance or a different result when they ask about specific members. You know, you put a, I don't know if it's the old model of, you know, the kind of the candidate being the face of the party and, you know, knowing a personality and having maybe had some personal contact or whatever. So this is the question, you know, do you approve or disapprove of the way that your representative from your congressional district is handling that? You know, and I think, so this is, yeah, again, it's so what do you then expect to see over the next week or two? What, I mean, as you said, for example, like McConnell came out today, I mean, predictions yesterday were that he was going to lose 50% of his own members, basically with almost any package, even if it's the $1 trillion lower ticket price of the two that they're contemplating, that roughly 50% of Republicans in the House, I'm sorry, in the Senate are going to say no matter what. And again, it's just November on their minds. So but what do you anticipate seeing?
So without a crystal ball, because it's really foggy, yeah. I would say this, that it seems Democrats to a large degree under Speaker Pelosi have the upper hand here because A, she's laid down a marker, she's shown that she can get a large majority for it in her House, and Democrats are unified around it. There's no second guessing of that package. And Mitch McConnell, representing essentially the next move here from the Senate Republicans, he can't, as you said, he can't do that. He doesn't have a majority. And so he's pieced together various different pieces. And each of those pieces may have a majority of the chamber, meaning of Republican votes. He doesn't have any Democratic votes. And there doesn't seem to be a Republican majority for the whole package. So he can't even put the package on the floor and dare the Democrats to vote against it to try to splinter the Democrats. Because that's part of the game too, not just keep your people together, but splinter the other side. So that's like his key tool in his pocket. And he can't wield it yet. So, and one might think, well, all the Democrats will vote for the House. All the Senate Democrats will support the House Democratic bill. Why doesn't he just admit defeat and put the bill on the floor? Well, unfortunately, these parties are so polarized and such partisan team play. They're not really, certainly not this stage of the game, going to do that. Mm-hmm. There could be a short-term stopgap, but my guess is only if it's on Democratic terms, which is to keep a really high level of benefits, extra benefits for the unemployment benefits.
Right. I mean, the last figures that I saw was saying that, again, it was somewhere between a $1 trillion and a $3 trillion aid package, with the Dems kind of, you know, pushing towards the higher end. And then at the same time, on the bottom end, you've got a bunch of, like I said, Republicans who are really terrified at the idea of a $1 trillion price tag. And at the same time, too, the White House seems to be kind of not playing a very clear strategy here or kind of leadership role, in part because I heard, for example, like a lot of Senate Republicans were furious that they were kind of throwing in some, if you will, pork barrel stuff in there, like a new FBI headquarters and stuff like that into the mix at several $1 billion, you know. So things are being tossed in there from the White House that are unrelated to COVID.
Yeah, and this goes to Julia's point before, that this president doesn't seem up to the task. And what does that mean? Well, from the congressional perspective, it's something we've seen throughout the Trump presidency, which is when your party has divisions and you hold the White House, the job of the president is really to provide political cover and chart the way forward and use your popularity to, you know, bring your party under your umbrella. But this president obviously can't do that because he isn't nationally popular, right? And there seems to be a lot of other issues, as Julie alluded to, about the competence of the White House and his own perspective of his role here and what he's to do. That leaves Republicans airing their dirty laundry all over the news 24/7.
What I want to do actually with the time we have remaining is about 5 minutes. I actually want to reverse roles here. I want to actually ask Professor Azari, how would she evaluate the congressional response? And then if we have time, I'd like to come back to Professor Binder and ask her how would she evaluate, as she kind of hinted at a little bit, the president's response. But Professor Azari, how would you evaluate the congressional response so far?
So I mean, this is where my identity as a presidency scholar probably shows through, because I'm like, which part of the congressional response, which party, which leaders? I think I'm going to dodge the question. I'm just telling you this right now. I think there's some complexity in terms of the role that members of Congress, especially leaders, but not just people who have official floor leadership roles, the role that they play in kind of public messaging and the role that Congress plays in doing policy making behind the scenes. So first of all, I guess I'll say it doesn't seem to me like the legislation that's coming out is really addressing the problems or making people's lives better or stopping the pandemic or improving the economy. So that's like, in that sense, I probably am, despite being a political science professor, not in a better position than anyone else to evaluate. I'm just kind of like, well, it doesn't seem good. But what fascinates me as a party politics person and a presidency person is this kind of increasing both pressure and opportunity for these leaders to kind of publicly showboat. And obviously, like, there's always been some of that. But now there are endless opportunities. And that's, I think, really striking when we look at the way that, someone said this, I wish I could remember who so I could attribute it, but someone had said that Republican members of Congress are really interested in creating content right now, and kind of throwing out controversial statements and doing controversial tweets. And I think that that's right. I also think I've been reading Molly Ball's biography of Nancy Pelosi. It's really fascinating and might be of interest to folks tuning in on this. And one of the things I think is really interesting there is Pelosi's effort to transition from being a kind of pretty like inside Washington kind of leader, someone who knows the game really well, to being this more public facing, okay, I guess I'm the mouthpiece of the, in this case, the kind of opposition party under a very controversial president. So I think that there's a lot of interesting things there in terms of tracking how different members are playing those roles, but I don't know that I'm really compelled by how anyone is occupying either of those roles in a way that is making the substance of people's lives better in this very difficult time.
Right. Well, let me then ask another question, which is again within your kind of professional wheelhouse. How do you think Biden is responding or to this circumstance / crisis?
I think that I think that Biden is in an interesting position here. I'm going to plug something else I wrote for 538, which is this was back in the spring, and I wrote about democratic values and norms and how the crisis really pushed at some of those. And I think Biden's in a tricky position because on the one hand, as you're running as a candidate, it's a big violation of norms to be the shadow president, right? And that's a situation where you want to kind of show some deference to the sitting president or deference to the office and the process. At the same time, we weren't seeing that. And this was when I wrote this was sort of like at the height of Trump doing these briefings that tended to just go off the rails. And so I think Biden's again in a tricky position. I think that he has shown some capacity to kind of message effectively in that he can convey empathy, which doesn't materially improve anyone's situation. But it is something that comes up again and again when we talk about presidential crisis politics. I mean, I think a lot about that in the Great Depression and Herbert Hoover, who was a very accomplished public servant and actually someone who was trying a lot of different policy solutions, but just could not convey that empathy. Empathy is proving a hard word for me to say right now, so that's not great. But I think that Biden has some advantages in that regard, and he's also proven to be pretty responsive to the activists in his own party in terms of the issues that he's chosen to communicate about and the stances that he's chosen to take.
Okay, yeah, well, that's I think you're making a pretty compelling series of points there. We have about 2 minutes left. I think we're going to try to field this poll again. The second poll question about how would you evaluate your own member. So again, it's do you approve or disapprove of the way that a representative from your congressional district is handling his or her job? So take a second to answer that. And then as you're doing that, I guess the final question would be to Professor Binder for this segment or this section of the talk today. So Professor Binder, how would you evaluate Trump's handling and or his general handling of the COVID pandemic and or his interaction with Congress? And also, what do you see potentially or not so much coming out of the Biden campaign? What is potentially there?
So the issue with, or my reflection on the president's role here and the president's performance is one of a piece of what has performance throughout his presidency when it has to dealing with Congress, which is, on the one hand, he needn't be involved in negotiating, deal making, and so forth personally. But he does need to provide some general parameters to his negotiators or to his party to make those agreements work well, rather than airing everything in back and forth in the airwaves. And if he were to just delegate everything, that might be fine. But the president insists on throwing things out there which his own party doesn't want or can't support. And it was the same thing in the healthcare. It was a little bit of that in the tax reform. And it's again here, it was even he did that on episodes where Republicans didn't want to legislate, whether it was on DACA, whether it was on gun regulations. So he's out of step with his own party. He latches onto particular things, so he throws them out as catchwords. This time it seems to be the FBI building. So there's no engagement with the issues. And one needn't be a policy nerd like Carter to be an effective president, but one has to have the political skill to lead your party, if not to reach beyond your party. And the president doesn't seem to have that ability or recognition of how much hurt and harm and damage has been done by the virus and what difference a national federal response would make. And that has left this lingering and left us in a place that seems quite dire.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we have just time left in this segment again to talk about the results of the second poll question, which came out here. So approval is up 58%. So there you have it. Disapproval is at 24, and not sure is at 18. So again, we've got results that are consistent with what the literature always tells us. People like their member, they do not associate them with their place of work, if you will. So again, I want to thank Professor Azar and Binder, and now I'm actually going to hand it over to Arjun Singh from WGBH, and he's going to facilitate the next section of this talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Conley. Thank you, Professor Azari and Professor Bender, for joining us. For this next section, we'll be first hearing from 4 different student speakers who will each have a question of their own. And then, as you may have noticed, we have opened up a question and answer box that you guys can ask our panelists themselves. I want to make sure that you guys know that we won't be able to get to every question that is asked today, especially if we have a lot of them, but we will try and get to as many as we can. So if you don't hear me say it up here, hopefully one of our professors who's monitoring those will be able to answer those as well. But while our students are getting ready, Professor Binder, I would like to direct this question towards you, which is that every now and then we do see members in Congress buck their party or stand up to their party. Most notably, we saw Mitt Romney vote to impeach the president. We've also seen people like Bernie Sanders very vocally criticize their party. In the House, we have people like Seth Moulton here in Massachusetts, who sort of led what some people called a revolt against Nancy Pelosi. But inside Congress, I guess the first part of this is, why don't more people speak out against their party if they seem to have policy positions or ran on platforms that run contrast to what the mainstream party is doing? And what are some of the repercussions that members of Congress may face within Congress for speaking out against their party?
So that's a great question. I think a couple things to keep in mind here is we live in a world of what we call polarization, and there are lots of things of what that means, but it captures not just ideological disagreements, between the parties, but it captures this notion of team play, that you're on the Democratic team and you're on the Republican team, and the rewards are for sticking with the team. There aren't great sticks if you break from it necessarily, but the rewards are there, whether it's campaign help, whether it's leveraging your particular bill to get into amendment on a bill, whether to get it on the floor and so forth. So get a good committee assignment. There are rewards for sticking with team play. But I think more importantly is the districts blue districts and red districts really look different demographically today than they used to, right? It's no accident that we are now at a level where when the president wins, president of let's say the Republican Party, the Republican president wins an election in a state, that state's senators are also elected from that party, right? So there's a continuity and a cohesiveness of views within these districts, certainly, and more generally within states. And so we shouldn't be surprised that there's so few people who break from it, because they tend to agree with one another. The other way, just to keep in mind, we don't want to exaggerate the degree of cohesion within these parties. And you certainly see that happening on the Senate Republican side, where there doesn't seem to be any restraint on Republican senators going and criticizing Mitch McConnell and what's going into this package. So the degree to which leaders can keep their members happy, we end up with more cohesive parties. But there are going to be events that are going to create incentives for these parties to fracture. And that's always the challenge of leaders, to try to get everybody on the same page to minimize the public airing of those distractions.
Great. Well, let's move on to our speakers right now. So for our first student speaker, we have Shayla Sullivan. She's an incoming freshman who's planning on studying journalism here at Suffolk. Shayla, welcome.
Thanks, Arjun. My question is for Professor Azari. Recently, the Trump administration has ordered hospitals to bypass the Center for Disease Control when relaying COVID-19 data, one of many instances where institutions have fallen victim to partisanship. What impacts are you most concerned about regarding hyper-partisanship, especially in terms of its effects on the federal government's response?
Great question. Yeah, so I think this is a really important issue, and I think this is right. The concern that you raise. So there's, for most of modern politics, there's been kind of a separation between administration and policy and governance and partisan politics. And it's not super clean, right? It's not super clean separation. There's politics everywhere. But we kind of expect that there are going to be some sources of information that are, if not neutral, that are not, going back to what Professor Binder was saying about team play, right? They're not the instrument of either team. And that seems to be increasingly not true. And that's a way that, I want to be fair here, but I also want to note that I think that this is a way that specifically this administration has attempted to undermine understood neutral sources of information and data. And I also see, I'm not an expert on how this is kind of playing out. Like, I'm not an expert on public opinion on conspiracy theories or anything like that. But I am seeing this anecdotally, that this question about, is information about COVID, are the stats on deaths, are the stats on cases, are those politicized, are those something that, Democrats are using to bring the administration down or what have you? Like, that is definitely a line of thinking that is out in the world. And so even if you don't have, I think maybe the key point is this, even if you don't have like two contending sources of information in this like donkey elephant clash, all you really need, I think, to undermine people's sense of self-governance and efficacy and ability to make good political decisions and good health decisions is to call it into question in a serious way, right? To call into question the idea that there are objective sources of information that you can look at that aren't just the instrument of the other team. So I think that's what really concerns, that's one of many things that concerns me. Wonderful question, thank you.
Thank you, Shayla. Up next, we have Gianna Tridenti. She's an incoming freshman who plans on studying radiation therapy. Gianna, welcome.
Thanks, Arjun. My question is for Professor Binder. When reopening the economy, not everyone is going to come to the same terms. A recent poll indicates that 93% of Americans do not think the economy should reopen immediately, even if the state is moving in a positive direction. What can Congress and the executive powers do better to ensure that the steps taken forward are going to be the best option for the people as well as the economy without putting anyone at risk?
So that's a great question, and it's a fundamental question for Congress and obviously the president to grapple with. But one way to think about it first is to go back to something that Professor Azari said, which is all this money, all these efforts, this swift, all this praise we've had for Congress, it doesn't actually seem to be working, right? And so it does raise the question, what is it that Congress can do? What is it that the federal government can do that in fact would make us look more like Europe or other Asian countries that in fact seem largely to have gone back, quote unquote, to normal? Of course, lawmakers will say it would have been worse without us, without the CARES Act. But of course, voters, and as you've just encapsulated, that's not the answer we want. We want policy solutions that actually work. Now, I'm not a policy person, so all I know is what I gleaned really from Dr. Fauci. So whatever Dr. Fauci says, I will do. I think one can't help but escape the conclusion, though, that there are millions of people, 30 million, still on unemployment. There are people who face eviction through no fault of their own. You face small business owners and large business owners and whole sectors of the economy that can't get back to normal. My hunch is if you copied some more of the policy solutions that are used in Europe, and there are reasons why we haven't, to give more direct aid to businesses to actually pay their payrolls, as well as to infuse a lot more money into testing, a lot more money into state aid to preclude layoffs, which are surely coming. I just think my sense is, again, not a policy person, but ramping up what's been done on steroids is the least that Congress should be considering, given that we are still in an economic and a health crisis.
Thank you so much, Gianna. Up next, we have Anna Sophia Sleeman. She's an incoming freshman who will be studying politics, philosophy, and economics, and she's calling in from Mexico City. Anna, welcome.
Thank you, Arjun, for the introduction. My question is directed to Professor Bender. My question is, currently there is a fifth bill relief package being debated in Congress to address the impact of the pandemic. Given the argument, what are both parties looking for, and what kind of compromise are Americans likely to see?
So that's the key question of the day in Washington, for sure. Democrats have staked out a position with the largest bill, even larger compared to the pieces that they've done already in March and April. They want to really flood the zone, and not to use a sports analogy that I can't follow up on. They want to see money put in areas that are at risk of economic risk. And for instance, state and local aid to get their budgets up to prevent layoffs, more money for testing, more money for healthcare in hospitals, and more money for unemployment benefits that otherwise would revert to lower levels come this weekend. Republicans have staked out a much narrower set of policy priorities, which have really hewed a little more closely to thinking about really almost more stimulus and less emergency relief, like crossing that barrier to kind of push businesses to open and so forth. Some money for testing, no new money for states and local, and then paring back unemployment insurance. So if I think of it in a line here between emergency relief and fiscal kind of financial stimulus, Republicans are pushing stimulus. Democrats are saying, whoa, the emergency is not yet over. And most likely they'll both get, if they come to a package, it'll be both of what they both want, a little bit of what they both want, as opposed to meeting in the middle on what they can agree on, because they really can't agree on very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. Up next, we have Anna Plum. She's an incoming freshman who'll be majoring in entrepreneurship. Anna, welcome.
Thank you, Arjun. My question is for Professor Azari. From your recent works, and publications about presidential mandates, you focused on the presidential mandates that tend to be invoked when their office is being questioned. With many Americans questioning President Trump's actions against the coronavirus, why do you believe there has been little action taken from his administration?
Great question. All right, you read some of my mandate stuff. This always makes me so happy. Yeah, so I mean, I think that it's part of the problem has been, I think I will actually say at the outset, some of it is a little bit puzzling, right? Some of it, the political logic is not clear because it seems like their best interest would be to really throw a lot of resources, political and financial and what have you, ask Congress to do so and really, double down on addressing this crisis because that's what's going to improve the economy, that's what's going to improve the status quo, and that would be very much in support of Trump's re-election interests. So in some ways, I think this is puzzling, and this is beyond the way most political scientists, myself included, have typically thought about how presidents do this stuff. On the other hand, I think that there is something in both the way that the sort of thinking around Republican principles of how government ought to relate to the economy and to society. We see a lot of rhetoric about personal responsibility. We see a lot of rhetoric. I mean, we saw a lot of rhetoric that was kind of early on in the coronavirus, kind of trying to redefine what was actually going on, right? And trying to suggest that this, we could understand it in a particular way. We could understand it in reference to China, as opposed to actually facing what it is head on. And I think that that's not terribly out of character for the Trump administration. And I think also that this kind of politics of rhetorical definition is part of the recent Republican project. And on top of that, the sort of notion that the federal government should have a limited role in the economy, should play a limited role in people's lives. And you can imagine, you can see this where Republican members of Congress are pretty resistant to the notion of big, financial supports for people, right, of payments. And that's quite in keeping with many years of their governing and ideology. So that's, I mean, this is kind of one of the things that we see when an era comes to an end. And I'm referring here to some work by actually one of my dissertation advisors, Stephen Skowronek. When an era comes to an end, we see that kind of like what the party has stood for and what they've believed up to that point, and what policy needs, what the country needs, those things are going in different directions. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing here.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you to all of our students that took the time to come on here and ask a question. Their questions were great. For this next portion, we are turning things over to you. So as I said earlier, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box that you see on the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible here during a conversation. And if not, hopefully our professors can answer your questions. So the first one I want to direct first to you, Professor Azari, while we're already talking, is it seems every presidency, there are complaints from the party out of power that the presidency has become too strong, that it has expanded too much. At the same time, Congress has expanded the presidency, in all fairness. Is there any talk now, particularly in the Trump era, of seriously curbing the powers of the presidency and putting some hard limits on it?
So I think there's a couple things going on here. One of those things is talking about kind of more literally putting boundaries on the role of the presidency. And I think that actually links back to, I don't know if anyone remembers this, but there was an impeachment earlier this year. Every now and then I have to remind myself. So I think we're going to see legislation around that, around kind of, what the president can and can't do, and more regulations around the presidency. I don't know if any of that will actually address the structural problem that has led to the situation we have now, which is this incredibly strong presidency, because, and here is where Professor Binder can tell me if I'm wrong, but where the politics of Congress are not fully set up to kind of lead on major national issues. And some of the things that Professor Binder was saying earlier about how the role of the White House is to provide, I think you said cover, right, for when there were intra-party disagreements. The role of the White House is to kind of coordinate across all different interests within the country and within the party coalition. Sometimes outside the party coalition and kind of create a focal point of like, here's the goal, here's the point of what we're doing. And then allowing Congress to do what it does, which is to represent all different interests, all different districts, all different states, often in a way that's like behind closed door negotiation, and come with a package. But the reason the presidency is so strong is because of this need for national coordination, because of this need for a kind of focal national leader. And I think we've seen two things with that with Trump. And one is that it really matters who's in that role and who does the gatekeeping for who ends up in that role. That person's judgment, that person's temperament, that's always been important. But I think now it's kind of front and center. The other thing about that is that Trump's path to the nomination and then to the White House is one of mobilizing minorities. I mean, by this I just mean a numerical minority, right? Winning 40% or so of the Republican vote in the primaries, and then actually being the electoral college winner, but not the popular vote winner, and coming to office with 46% of the vote. So I think the other thing we know is actually the presidency isn't that national majority wielder necessarily, right? We can have a president that is just as bound to a political minority as you might see in a congressional context. I don't know where that leaves us. This is not promising. But that's sort of what I think is like, we'll see some legislation to try and formally limit what the president can do. That may or may not be effective, but this structural problem goes much deeper than that, and is not going to be simply addressed with a straightforward policy solution.
Professor Binder, what do you think? Do you think that there will be a legislative solution to the expanded presidency? And as Professor Azari touched on, is there a legislative solution to an expanded presidency?
Well, I guess I would always think of it as someone who studies Congress. From my perspective, one of the reasons the presidency and the executive branch has so much authority and power is that Congress has delegated it to the executive branch, that members of Congress don't want that responsibility, right? So we think about the power to declare war. Well, the efforts to try to recoup that power, because Congress rarely declares war, but presidents send military troops abroad quite frequently, right? When Congress has tried to recoup that power, it's not been very successful. And we've seen that throughout the Trump administration with efforts to pare back US involvement in Yemen, support for Saudi Arabia, the effort to rewrite the authorization for use of force abroad, that's gone nowhere. So Congress delegates this authority. It created the national security state itself back in the wake of World War II, and it's very, very hard, absent one large unified party control. It's very hard to recoup those powers, and that's why it's come to a head, I think, in large part because the president seems very unconstrained, not even by the power of the purse, right? With his willingness to locate some monies to spend them on the border wall. And members of Congress, Democrats attacking him and voting to call back that power, and Republicans by and large saying, no, it's okay. We trust him.
I would say my 2 cents on this is that actually connect statements that both Professor Azari and Professor Binder stated. Is if you look at the constitutional origins of the outlines too of the presidency and this ability to kind of act nationally and decisively, and then the willingness of presidents forever, but certainly since post World War II, to basically manufacture crises that they need to respond to, right? And the utter unwillingness and political weakness of Congress to in any way challenge that, because again, it goes back to blame avoidance. What member of Congress wants to say, no, I don't want the president to have oversee a massive surveillance state when the next terrorist attack happens in the United States, right? And then you say, we blame you. You didn't protect us.
Professor Conley, actually, if we could stick with you for 1 second, when we're speaking about the presidency, a lot of people are commenting that the Republican Party is turning into the party of Trump, that Trump has left an indelible mark on the Republican Party. In your research, I want to open it up to both of you as well. Does it seem like Trump has really made a powerful mark on the Republican Party in the same manner that a Ronald Reagan did or an FDR did in the Democratic Party? Or does that seem very, at the moment, sort of hype around that?
That's a good question. Look, I study political parties in the United States. I often describe political parties as bags of cats that have been tossed into a river and poked at. By the way, not to offend anyone's cat, you know. And of course, we're going to have Zoom, so we always have cats that are listening, right? But basically, look, they're factions. When I say that they're bags of cats, they're factions. And so you have different political factions that compete with each other. And I think actually Trump was representative of a relatively marginal but a political faction that did exist, ideological faction that did exist and has existed in the Republican Party. It's a sliver of what was called conservatism that kind of came out in the mid-1950s, but it's a particularly marginal, and by the 1980s, overtly racist kind of faction that was a marginal element of the far, far conservative right. So I think that basically what you saw was you saw the success of that faction. So for example, what do I mean by that? Like, it's like the Pat Buchanan kind of wing of the Republican Party. You go back to the 1980s, you can find think tanks that subscribe to this worldview that were advising the exact same platform that Trump took in 2016, back in 1992 and in 1996. It's just that everyone thought they were, completely, off the rails, and even within established conservative, intellectual community. And Pat Buchanan tried to run on it, but he obviously didn't win. It worked for Trump. So I don't know. I mean, my guess would be that you're going to see a pushback from a more centrist, if you will, conservative dominant faction.
And Professor Azari, what do you think? And also, just as a side note, for all of you listening, if you don't know about Pat Buchanan's presidential run, I highly recommend reading into it. Some pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this a lot. I'm supposed to write a paper about this to present in about a month. So, so obviously I've written nothing, but I've thought a lot. And I think that, a year or so ago, I would have said Trump has really left an indelible mark on the Republican Party, even though, as Professor Conley points out, a lot of what he's doing draws on these very old kinds of notions within the Republican Party. I would say, so like thinking about the 1950s that Professor Conley points out, one thing that really struck me, I was looking through the papers of Robert Taft, who ran in 1952 for president as this kind of hardcore conservative candidate, and you see some comparisons between the Trump wing of the party and the Taft wing. So now we've gotten into the 50s, but he was the establishment candidate, right? He was a senator. He's from a political family, and that has shifted. I think maybe in the 70s, you see the Republican Party sort of shift to this notion where conservatism and outsiderdom become really closely linked. And I think Trump kind of is like the pinnacle of that. And I think that he also potentially reflects a kind of transition point where that might change. And that might mean that people think more about governing experience and expertise and relationships when they select presidential candidates. But I also think that what we're seeing is that there are a number of people with a sort of Trump-style orientation, their attitudes on immigration, their attitudes on the Republican Party as a team, and this kind of owning the libs kind of notion. Those folks are also now in a lot of powerful positions. And I think, I don't want to, again, kind of pick on Republicans specifically, but that was the question. So I think that that's where the Trump mark on the Republican Party is going. So it's, I think, going to split into a couple different trajectories.
And Professor Bender, how about you? Do you think that we're going to be seeing Trump Republicans existing in Congress and the party for the foreseeable future?
It's such a hard question for all the reasons Professor Conley and Azari have said. I think what is striking to me is if we're listening to these Senate Republicans who are opposing the House bill and McConnell's efforts to coordinate a bill, they're not really taking quote unquote Trumpian positions, right? I don't hear them calling out for doing things to attract and to address the needs of white working class voters who have been hardest hit by the economic and not hardest hit by the health crisis, but certainly by the economic fallout. So they're making about the ideological arguments about too much spending and so forth. And so it's not clear to me who the heirs are to Trump within the congressional context. So yeah, all eyes on November.
And looking at what's happening in the Democratic Party right now, we are in the middle of many of their primaries are happening right now. The pandemic is a big thing. So it seems like on the congressional level, we saw Jamal Bowman win in New York. We are seeing candidates running somewhat to the left of establishment people. I mean, even here in Massachusetts, Alex Morse, Mayor Holyoke, is running to the left of Richard Neal. But at the same time, the party also nominated one of their arguably more moderate candidates to lead the entire ticket. What are we seeing as the pandemic's influence in these current 2020 primaries on the Democratic Party, Professor Bender?
Wow. My sense of it, without being a party person, so I'll probably deflect this to my colleagues here. My sense of it is that these rumblings within the Democratic Party were in place long before the pandemic. And although there may be some frustrations with the pandemic response, this is about a sort of generational shakeup on the Democratic side, pulling that party in a more progressive direction, a more diverse direction, Joe Biden notwithstanding. And those currents predated the pandemic and will likely, as you suggested, keep rumbling through the Democratic Party.
Professor Azari, what do you think?
So I want to add two brief things to this. And one is that I think constantly about what the primary would have been like if it had started in March.
Mm-hmm.
I remember a pundit of some sort, talking about Bernie Sanders. So there's this like brief moment when it looked like Bernie Sanders was going to win. And I remember him saying, how are the Democrats going to run with an avowed socialist who's running against capitalism when there's 3% unemployment? This was like in mid-February. So that question changes a lot by mid-March. And I wonder about it. I mean, not in any particular, having any particular dog in that fight, but whether that would have recontextualized some of those arguments. At the same time, I don't know, right? Biden clearly commanded some really important constituencies within the Democratic Party, and the transition point for him seemed to be winning the endorsement of Jim Clyburn and winning the South Carolina primary. So that's all. Like, the Democratic Party is really complicated. It's very much Professor Conley's bag of cats. The other thing, though, that I want to say is, as you're talking about some of the recent primary winners who've defeated incumbents or defeated more established candidates, is that I'm starting to see, and I don't want to fall into the whole Tea Party to the left kind of thing, but I am starting to see the ways in which outsiderdom in the Democratic Party is also equated with progressivism, and that the person who's coming in from the outside is the person who is more authentic, is more, is closer to potentially to a less privileged experience, things like that, and how that then becomes a similar kind of line of argumentation to what the Republicans have had over the last 40 years, where outsiderdom has become a kind of way of expressing conservatism. And I think that's, I will say that I think that way of equating ideology and outsiderdom is not great. It's not that we shouldn't draw from people from all different walks of life and that politics doesn't need to be refreshed with new people, but I think that thinking that coming from the outside is the only way that you can be authentic, and that once you've actually gained some power, some governing expertise, that you've made compromises and now you're unacceptable, I think that's a problem. So I think that's not a great trajectory, even as it brings in some exciting new people and some generational refreshing in the Democratic coalition.
Professor Conley, what do you think's happening to the bag of cats? Are we getting a lot of new left-wing bag of cats coming in there?
Well, no, exactly. That's a great question. I mean, I honestly, I think the situation is, honestly, if you were to press down on it, what's going on within the Democratic Party is similar to what's happening and has happened in the Republican Party, that you have this time from the left, you have like an insurgent or resistance against kind of mainstream inside the Beltway politics. But honestly, push comes to shove, it is not as well organized as conservatism was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and 90s when it took over the Republican Party. The left is just not organized enough, and it's shown its organizational weakness and the ability to push to catapult someone like Sanders or Warren into the leadership position in terms of the nomination. And here we have a candidate who is not exciting anyone, yet he won. And I mean, partly it could have been because maybe towards the end there, Warren and Sanders neutralized each other, but I kind of don't think that happened. I think in some respects, like the Sanders revolution didn't materialize on the ground. Yeah.
We have only time for one last question and some sort of closing thoughts from you guys. And I think to sum up what a lot of people have been asking about, which is partisanship, does compromise, is that rewarded from our elected officials? Is that really what people want out of their elected officials? Do they want them to make a compromise that maybe isn't the exact deal they had hoped for, their constituents hoped for, but did get something passed? And what are some closing thoughts you would leave our students after reflecting on this conversation? So Professor Conley, why don't we start with you?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I think one of the things I've learned from studying the rise of conservatism from the 60s into the 1980s is that conservatives would always say, win or lose an election, but never lose on your issue, never lose on your position. That is never compromise. That is, you can lose again and again and again, you never change your core positions. And they took a very, very much a long-term strategy. And so in terms of ideological kind of politics in the United States, the lesson that in terms of what worked for conservatives in the 60s to 80s was not to compromise. And I don't necessarily support that position, but I would say that there's clear evidence that the fact that the Democratic Party remains what I would describe as an electoral party as opposed to an ideological party. That is, it's constantly trying to figure out how to win like certain voter segments in order to like either create a big enough coalition for the presidency or to win a Senate race. And people just always seem to take away, more often than the Dems would want, their takeaway from that is that the Democratic Party lacks a core kind of principled foundational message and set of values.
Professor Azari, how about you?
So to answer the question about compromise, research suggests no, compromise isn't rewarded. But I think that that's really linked to our current environment of messaging and the fact that what most people get out of government is messaging. And I think that, and this is, I think my takeaway for the students is dig a little deeper, right? Learn a little bit more. Don't accept the things that you're told by politicians or whoever at face value. And one of the lessons there is learn about if a bill passes, don't just think like, oh, did this compromise or not, but like who benefited, right? Who was in the room when that was being discussed? And that I think is really the trick here, is that legislation, whether it's more about your member voted for compromise or they stuck to their principle, is that normal Americans aren't seeing a lot out of those policies. So then the question is, who is, and how can that change? And that's, I think, really the crux of all of this, is that it is really challenging and really partisan, and I think in a lot of ways really rotten, but it doesn't have to be that way. Politics is about choices.
And Professor Bender, what are the last words that you'll leave our audience tonight with?
Well, as Professor Azari alluded, when we do experiments to try to figure out the answer to these questions, we find people only like compromise if they perceive that their side has won, which kind of undermines the whole idea of compromise. So, but Congress does get rewarded when it solves problems. It gets much higher approval ratings when people see that it is actually trying to make progress. But we've been in a long period here where such successes are really few and far between.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists, Professors Bender, Azari, and Connolly, for joining us today. Thank you to everybody who participated and asked questions. And thank you finally to everybody who watched us today. I hope you guys join us next week, and I'll pass it on to Professor Coolidge now.
Thanks, Arjun. I want to echo you in thanking all of our panelists. It was a great discussion, bags of cats and all. I'm sure that is a takeaway that is not going to be quickly forgotten. I want to invite everyone to join us next week when we're going to have a different angle and approach to thinking about what is the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. And we're going to be talking about legal issues, risk, liability, and liberty, with a really great panel. We're going to have Rachel Rollins, Shannon Liss Reardon, and our moderator is going to be Suffolk's very own Renee Landers. So I hope to see you all here next week, and thanks for joining us.